This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Church attendance is on the decline. That's according to a Gallup poll taken in June. And the pandemic might not be to blame. Church attendance was falling even before 2020 among every major religion and subgroup. Many churches are rethinking how to attract new parishioners and what ministry and social justice means in the 21st century. This weekend, the United Church on the Green will welcome Reverend Dr. Stephen G. Ray Jr. as the church's first Black minister. This historic church in New Haven played a key part in the abolitionist movement, and today, Reverend Ray joins us to talk about his hopes for the church as he moves forward with it. Reverend, thank you so much for joining us in studio this morning.
Good morning. It's great to be with you.
And for our listeners, you can give us a call and join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, very exciting thing that's happening this weekend, but we want to start by asking you, what's your origin story? How did you get started? What attracted you to the ministry life?
Well, it began with a clear call from God. So when I was called to the ministry, I had a successful financial planning practice in Midtown Manhattan, and I was very happy with that. And I could see a future for that. In fact, I jokingly told my wife that I was going to build what at that time was the biggest show on TV, Dynasty. That was my plan, to build the Ray Dynasty in financial services. But then I received a call to the ministry, and I accepted it. And at the time, I was going to Horace Bushnell Congregational here in Hartford. Now it's Victory Life. But there was a program that had just been funded that would provide immediate social services to people in one of the poorest sections of Hartford. And so it was a major kind of change. But for me, my mother had always raised me that if you feel that God is calling you to do something, you just go do it. And so I did, and that's what set in motion this life of more than 35 years of being a pastor, teaching, being a seminary president. It was all set in motion by that beginning point of saying yes to what I understood to be a call.
So it sounds like Ray Dynasty looks a little bit different from what you were thinking in the first place.
It does. It does. It looks quite a bit different. I mean, I think that given that I spent so many years teaching, there are ways in which I live in the world through the ministries, the work of my students who are working in nonprofits, who are working in churches, who are working in corporations. So I have students who are, and there's a way that knowing that I was a part of their formation is so encouraging and so satisfying, because that's my dynasty now. My dynasty isn't that we have a seat on an exchange somewhere or that we have a particular sort of relationship with American Express or with Edward R. Jones, but it's that there are people in the world who are changing the world and who are making this world a better place. So I'm so much more satisfied, I think, than if I had had the other Ray Dynasty.
Well, I'm sure a lot of your students and their families and friends are happy to be a part of this Ray Dynasty. And, you've just mentioned that you've been in this for over 30 years. How has the ministry changed for you, from start to today? Or has it changed?
Well, I think the biggest change in the ministry has been that the church has moved to a place where it is on the margins of society, even though it's physically still in the middle of society. So, for instance, my church is right on the green. So even though we may be, as a social and cultural force, not as powerful as we once were, we are still there. And so that's one of the big changes, is that physically the church is still there in so many places, but in terms of being a cultural and social force, it's not what it used to be. And seeing that change happen, and honestly, Catherine, I don't grieve that, because I think there's a significant way that we took for granted very much of what we ought to be doing because we thought we could call our legislature or legislator rather, to do it, or we could call our alderman to do it. Because we had significant sort of power, we ceded some of our work in our ministry to the other social and cultural agencies that we were adjacent to. So in a way, I can't say that I grieve the loss of that place, because it's giving us an invitation to reinvent ourselves and step into the public square in a different way, so that we can bring our hopes and our visions and our passions about a better and just world in new ways, because the world has changed.
Well, and I think we have a lot of conversations about change. It can be for good, depending on your perspective and how you go about it. And we will talk about more of the social and cultural changes throughout this conversation. But you mentioned, new things, new inventions, different things that the church can do. And I think you also see ministry as social justice. So can you talk about what that means to you? Explain to our listeners, what role does a church play in social justice?
Okay. So I think that in terms of social justice, for the part of the church in which I live, the United Church of Christ, that is at the core of our identity. And it has been for my entire life. It's meant different things. But what it means for us today is that when we are living in the world, we're inviting people to join us in ministries that transform the world. So my vision of ministry is that when someone comes and they visit with us or want to be with us, the first thing I'm not going to do is ask you to be on a committee. The first thing I'm not going to do is to ask you to fill out a pledge card. What I am going to ask you is, how can we help you live your passion? Your passion, because of who we are, people who aren't particularly concerned about social justice won't find us that interesting, because that's at the center of who and what we are. So when people do come to us, the question becomes, how can this be a place that can help project your passion into the world and help you become a change agent in ways that you could not have imagined? So that's what I think that the church can do, because one of the things I learned in teaching those many years, because I was teaching people who were in their 20s and in their 30s, is that what they were concerned about was not ensuring the survival of an institution, but rather they were concerned about a faith that transformed the world and made it better than the world that they had known. My daughter always reminds me that when she was in 8th grade, September 11th happened. So what that meant was the world that was created by September 11th, when we talk about the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, when we talk about the unleashing of waves of Islamophobia that have never left our society, when we talk about ways of thinking of immigrants as being a blight as opposed to the bridge to the future, all of these things, people who are in their 20s, 30s, and early 40s, this is the world they grew up in, and this is the world that they want to see different. They want to see a different world. And from my perspective, what the church does is give them the possibility of taking and magnifying what their passions are in building this new world in ways that they could not have imagined.
And you mentioned transformation, passion, change, and social justice. Are these all elements that attracted you to working at the United Church on the Green? Or, what attracted you to be here?
Exactly that. Because when I saw that the church had an opening, and I sent my profile to them so we could begin a conversation. It was their profile as a church that was deeply involved in social action, deeply involved in social justice, and wanting someone who could help them discover what that means in this new world that attracted me. So it was only secondarily that it was coming back to New Haven, because we were enjoying where we were living at. Now, coming back to New Haven has been a joy for me, but that wasn't the critical point. The critical point was who and what the church was, one that was dedicated from its history long ago, back during a time in which it was, as you mentioned, a church of abolitionists, when it was a part of that movement, when it was a part of the civil rights movement, when it was a part of the movement for the Black Panther trials, when it was a part of the movement to become the first open and affirming church here in Connecticut back in 1989. When it was so it's always been on the forefront of a changing world and wanting to be, to use an old phrase, on the right side of history. That attracted me to them.
Well, and the way you just describe the church and also your own background, there's so much history, there's so much mission that you want to do with this church. So how do you connect the two together, the history and the mission of this church? Can you walk our listeners through how the church became more open and affirming and what that means to you to be a part of that process now?
Well, I think in terms of what it means historically is that what the church did was it stepped up to the call of history. And that's the most that you can ask anyone to do or any church to do, is that in their time and in their place, when the call of history, and what I mean by the call of history, I know that sounds like archaic language and all that, but it actually is true that there are major turning points in our society. There are major turning points in human history, and we can choose to be a part of that in ways that are creating generative and creative ways of imagining a new world and living into it, or we can just sort of take a seat on the sidelines and worry about ourselves. And there are very, very many churches that do that in the midst of times of change, they decide that it's more important for them to be concerned about ensuring the sort of internal life of the church. United has every step of the way done that. Now, one of the things that's going to be critically important, and I talked about the church with this, is that we live in a time when LGBTQIA, but particularly trans families and trans people, are under significant cultural and social and political assault by many forces within our society. And there are very few churches that are willing to step up to the plate and say, this is a place that you can be. And that's it. That you can be your full self, that you can be fully who God has called you to be. Your children can be who they are. So I ran across a term I hadn't heard before, gender expansive, which is a way of talking, another way of talking about some trans folk and some trans children. So my vision for the church is that in this cultural moment, there are ways in which there are very many communities that are under assault. LGBTQIA trans community, the immigrant community of various shades from around the world. If you're from any place other than Europe, then you're fine. But if you're from any place other than Europe, the people are contesting you having a right to be here. Our being a part of creating a space in which people can experience the fullness of their humanity in the midst of people who celebrate that with them is what I think is the call of history at this moment.
And as we continue to sort of witness that contestment of people who are not from Europe, who have immigrated here to the United States, and as you mentioned, we are in a changing world, we're getting into a new world, there's a lot of transformation, which also means we have more conversation and people are more comfortable with talking about, for example, we were just saying, talking about the LGBTQIA community. So with that in mind, too, what does abolishing homophobia in the church and actively being open and affirming and also being inclusive look like? How do you start to welcome those communities into the church?
Well, the first thing you do is you invite people to do two things. One, I invite them, and our church will invite them to tell us, what do you need from us? To feel as if we are sincere. We're not going to tell you what we're going to do to show you that we're sincere. We're going to ask you, what do you need to see from us? And the second and most important question is, what does our life as a church need to look like in terms of programming, in terms of how we use our space, etc., in which you will feel the sort of safety and affirmation that is what is our deepest desire. Because part of what being and growing up as a Black person in America, and I'll cut to the real part now, is that I've spent most of my career and most of my life in liberal white organizations who were always telling me about how anti-racist they were, about how pro-Black they were, but they never asked me whether or not I felt that they were being anti-racist, or if I experienced their spaces as being that way. They just assumed that they should tell me, and I should say, okay, thank you. And so I take that wisdom and lifelong learning from being in institutions to doing those two things. What do you need to feel from us, and what does our life need to look like in order for you to feel that this is a place for you to feel as if you can be fully who you are? Your trans child can feel that he, she, or they can be fully who they are, and they will be loved for the human being that they are and the child of God that they are. So that's really the work. And then we can figure out all the other stuff, in terms of what does service look like, what kind of program. We can figure all that other stuff out. But if we don't do those two things, then I think it'll just be more of the same of people telling you that you're welcome, but then also telling you why you should be happy that they're telling you that you're welcome.
Right. And that's so much to go through, really, for anyone. And as you describe sort of your practice of inclusivity, do you think it starts with, we also talk about history a lot just now, and do you think it starts with sort of acknowledging the history of how the Christian church have treated the LGBTQIA people in the religion itself? And is that a part of the conversation of helping people become more comfortable that this is a safe space and being truly loved and included in this church?
I'm of a mixed mind about that. And what I mean by that is that for a very long time and part of my career, I was engaged in DEI work in schools of theological education, seminaries, and divinity schools. And I was engaged in anti-racism work. And one of the dangers is always that when you remember the sort of ways that your institution, your church, has been hurtful, has been harmful, you run the risk of it being a self-referential remembrance. So you still remain at the center of the story, right? So where the point is to get other people into the story and help make their story a part of the story, you can do it in such a way that even when you're talking about your sins, you're still the point of the story. And everyone else is just sort of waiting in line to become a supporting cast member in terms of how you're telling the story. So what that means for me then is that I think that there is a reflection that is necessary on what the church was, but it's much more important to me to ask people to help us make the church something different, to help us build a future that is different than the past. Because part of what the past was to use one of the 75-cent words I always call it in my sermons, is that you have to let go of your normativity. You can't always be the center of the story, whether we're talking about when you did good or you're talking about you did bad. The point is you can't always be the center of the story. And the only way that changes is if you invite others to be a part of the story by telling the story through their voice, by telling the story through their experience, by telling the story through their witness. And that's how you discover new ways of being.
You've been listening to Reverend Dr. Stephen G. Ray Jr., who is going to be the new minister of United Church on the Green in New Haven. He'll be staying with us to talk about the church's efforts to be more open and affirming and welcome new parishioners to the parish. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Reverend Dr. Stephen G. Ray Jr. will be installed as the new minister of United Church on the Green in New Haven this coming Sunday, and he'll be the church's first Black minister. He joins us today in studio to talk about the changing mission of ministry in this church and what it means to be open and affirming. So, Reverend, we've talked a lot about history, a lot about the present, too. And you also mentioned how we've seen several waves of church renewal and efforts for church growth, especially, pre-post-pandemic. And it seems like we're in another period of that. We have many waves, it seems like, in the present. So what does growing the church look like for you?
Well, there are two dimensions. One is growing the church is growing the number of people and organizations who are invested in your future or our future as a church because they believe we have a critical role in our community. So growing the church isn't just about getting more people in the pews. I mean, that's part of it. But the big part of it is getting people, institutions to become so invested in our life because of what we are contributing to the community in which we live, that we have ensured that there are those who will always not just mean us well, but who will ensure that we are well. And the second thing is that we leverage then that to give people opportunities to live out the passions of their hearts around justice and around issues of social action. Because one of the things in teaching in seminary for so many years I came to profoundly believe is that you hear a lot of people talk about, the growth of the nuns, the group of nuns in terms of the millennial Gen X generation. My take was a little bit differently. It's not that they were nuns in terms of religious belief, passion, etc. They just weren't interested in what we were selling. And so part of using the sort of approach that I use to leadership is that the way you engage people is by giving them an opportunity to give voice to their deepest yearnings and giving them an opportunity to live through the ministry of the church so that the ministries of the church reflect what they want the world to be. And giving folk an opportunity, and I am confident that given what I know of multiple generations, from having taught from so many years, that is what people are hungry for. They're not hungry to replicate their parents' world. They're hungry to build a new world. And if you simply ask them, how can we be partners with you in doing that there are more than enough people who would become a part of that. And
with what you just said, too, talking about the younger generation, why do you think they, as you mentioned, sometimes you're selling something that they don't want to be a part of, or they want to be a part of that's something different, but they don't know how to do that in this space. So why do you think the younger generations have kind of shied away from organized religion? What are some of the things that what are some of the reasons for that, you think, besides what you just mentioned?
Well, I think we were caught in the perfect storm during the last part of the 20th century and maybe the first 10, 15 years of the 21st century, is that the church had become, particularly the mainline Protestant church, had become deeply invested in changing society through working through the bureaucracies of our society, working through our city councils, working through our state legislature. So that's how they tried to exert their force. And the people who were actually doing on-the-ground ministry, significantly doing the kind of ministry that's person to person, that's trying to change the world that way, were largely socially conservative evangelicals. So the reason why I'm saying it was the perfect storm is because the social justice and social action dimension of religion that is so motivating to younger generations, the main line was doing it on a corporate level and wasn't really trying to connect with them. So when people came and joined the church, the only thing people would ask you is, well, what committee do you want to join? How can we sign you up to pledge? And that's not what people came asking for. And on the other hand, when they found people who wanted to engage them on that individual level, they also were inviting them into a world of racism, homophobia, misogyny, and all of the things that characterize very much of the conservative practice of religion. So that's what I mean by the perfect storm. So when those were your two alternatives, you can see why you would choose none of the above. So that's my take on it.
And do you think it's challenging to get people involved in the church? Because we mentioned a little bit about intergenerational. You got parents and kids and families going to church, but is it challenging to get people involved when they don't have family members who are involved in the church?
Well, it's almost, I think, and I'll test this hypothesis, but I think it's almost easier because when people come then, they're not coming to their parents' church, but they're coming to the church that's inviting them to be the church. And I think that there's a real and significant way that is the growth area for churches such as mine that have a particular vision about transforming the world, is that when people come in, and it's not their parents, it's not their grandparents who are there, it's not their family church, but it's a place in which other people of multiple generations who have a similar passion and commitment, they then become your siblings and your parents and your grandparents in the struggle for justice and the struggle for peace. And so I think that in a way it helps us.
And despite the fact that church attendance is down, we're still seeing the ripple effects of that perfect storm you just described, and we have a lot of movements going on, whether it's social justice or things that are going on internationally. Do you see this as a spiritually hungry time? Do you think people are craving for the space that you are describing?
Oh, yes, I think so. And I actually trace it back to where we saw the first outpouring with Occupy Wall Street, right? Because that was a movement where people were trying to imagine a different world, a world in which we could have fullness, a world in which we could have a generative space to share our humanity, not constantly under assault. And then we began to see it with the Black Lives Matter movement, with Ferguson. So I think that it's been expressing itself. And it's been expressing itself in terms of a passion for a new and different world. And so that's been my motivation, is seeing that it's there and asking people, how can we as a church be a place you can live that out and find others who are living that out so that you can build the kind of life. And here's the key. Build the kind of life that your parents and grandparents had, in the regard that you have people who are connecting with you on the deepest level of your being, people who are connecting with you on the deepest level of what your passion is for the world, people who are allowing you to express your humanity in ways that you find joy that you can't find anywhere else.
And so your motivation has led you to become the first Black minister of the United Church on the Green in New Haven. How do you think the role of Black church has changed and evolved in the 21st century?
A few ways. Number one, I'm a product of the Black church. Although I have been a part of the United Church of Christ my entire life, which is a largely white denomination, I've grown up in the Black stream of that church my entire life, and my ministry has unfolded in that. What has changed, I think, are the same things that have changed within the larger society. But one of the significant things that has changed is that we and people who are in the Black church, and particularly people who are serving churches that are predominantly Black, if not all Black churches, is that the ferocity of the white backlash that took body with the Trump movement has meant that we live in a time now, and I'm not overstating it. It's going to sound like hyperbole, but it's not. My daughter materially has fewer rights than I did when I was her age, and she only has a few more than my mother did when she was her age. So part of what the Black church has always been is it's been a place where the nurture of Black aspiration, the nurture of Black hope, the nurture of Black faith is a place that is enfolded. So that is what its role now is. It's a sort of a moment of retrenchment to try to hold on to what we've lost. And I'm going to repeat that one more time because I could see the look on your face when I said it. My daughter has fewer rights today than I did when I was 32 years old. And she only has a few more than my mother did when she was 32 years old. So in that world, holding on to what we have and nurturing a future becomes the critical role. And that's the critical role that the Black church has played. And one of the things I'm hoping is that the wisdom as well as the creativity that comes from being shaped by that church can help United become a space in which it can imagine its future in a different way.
And as you see my brain trying to process all of that, I think that would resonate with a lot of people, myself included, actually. And, you go into this, not a new space, but this church with this philosophy, with this idea, with this reality. What do you hope this church can bring to your parishioners or to yourself?
Well, what it can bring and what I hope for the parishioners is the experience of living into the deepest desires of their heart for a different world, for a world in which everyone is able to find their lives as being something that is more than just worth living, but something to be celebrated, and they can be a part of that. Because one of the things I've witnessed in my ministry and my teaching in the spaces in which I've moved is that the experience of being with people who are discovering and rejoicing in their humanity is like nothing else in the world. I mean, when you find people who really it clicks that I am beloved of God and I am somebody, there is nothing like that feeling. So I hope that for the people in my church, in terms of us being able to experience it for ourselves, but more importantly, to be able to create spaces in which others can experience that. For myself, given that this will likely be the end of my full-time career, if you will, once I end my time at United, if I've been able to even succeed in a small way in the dream that I have for the church, then there's an old song in the Black church, and the chorus is, "My living will not have been in vain."
And Sounds like you have so many things going on, Reverend. And as we talk about the new, we talk about the old, and then having them all kind of center together in this present day. Coming up next, we're going to be hearing from the Yale Divinity School and learn about a new project that's centered around eco-theology. So we talk about social justice, and also part of the church's mission is empowering your parishioners to be good stewards of the earth. So what does this look like? Because there's an environmental task force that was established in 2008. What does a commitment to environmental justice look like for the church?
Well, this is where another part of my work, because I was a theologian for many years, writing books, teaching, is we have to, within the Christian community, find a different way to tell our story. Because what I mean by that is that the problem that we have today, and this is a discreetly Christian problem, is that we have as our final hope that the world will come to an end. Right? That's if you read the book of Revelation, that's what the Christian hope is that in what we call the resurrection, when Jesus comes back, that's going to be the end of things as we know it. Well, the problem with that is that if that's what your hope is, then it's hard to get you really excited about the world as it is.
Right.
So a part of what our challenge, and I'm currently writing a book about this, it'll take me a few years to get it done, but we have to tell a different story, a story about how the world in a space of flourishing is the greatest wish and the greatest hope of God and therefore of us. So that's the contribution we make. We tell our story in a different way. We don't tell a different story, but we tell it in a different way so that people value this creation that we have. Because until I can get you to think that creation is a good thing that ought to exist for as long as it possibly can, until I can get you to that point, it's hard to get you to the next point of thinking about having environmental responsibility, because in the back of your mind, you're always thinking, well, I'm only going to be here for a while anyway, so.
Right. Well, thank you so much to Reverend Dr. Stephen G. Ray Jr., who is a minister at the United Church on the Green. Thank you so much for being on the show today and for sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you. It's been a joy. Thank you.
And coming up next, we'll be hearing from the Yale Divinity School about their efforts to install more green living spaces for students and bridging the gap between religion and environmental justice. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We've been talking about the relationship between religion and environmental justice. One possible solution for bridging that gap here in Connecticut is the Living Village Project. The project is going to be a net positive energy building that will provide affordable housing to students, and it broke ground at Yale last week. Several branches of the university are involved in this project, including Yale Divinity School. And joining us now to talk about it is Dean Gregory Sterling. He is the Dean of Yale Divinity School and the Reverend Henry L. Slack Dean and Lillian Claus Professor of New Testament. Dean Sterling, thank you so much for joining Where We Live today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's especially nice to follow Stephen Ray, who's one of our alums.
Well, congratulations, and happy to hear that. I want to start this conversation. We left off earlier talking about sort of bridging the gap between religion and environmental justice. Can you describe what the origin story of the living villages are?
Sure. This began out of the LEED movement, which most people know about. But there was a young architect by the name of Jason McLennan who was working with a very large architectural firm heavily involved in LEED standards, who thought that LEED didn't go far enough because LEED ultimately still is a way of containing or limiting the harm done to the environment. Jason wanted to extend beyond that to a regenerative model that would give back to the environment. So he developed what's called the Living Building Challenge. This was first launched in a large conference in Denver in 2006. There were about 13,000 people there, I think, when this was launched. Jason gave one of the preliminary speeches to preliminary to one of the preliminary speeches, and was very warmly received by many, including the plenary speaker who endorsed this proposal. And from that, you had a movement that began to develop. Jason offered to sell the standard once it was fully developed to the U.S. Green Building Council. That was the host of LEED standards. They considered it. He offered to sell it to him for $1, and ultimately they declined. So he went to a different firm, Cascadia, and created the Living Building Challenge. One of the people who was instrumental in this was Dennis Hayes, who was the first national coordinator for Earth Day. Dennis was the chair of the Bullitt Foundation, and the two of them then partnered, and the Bullitt Foundation built what is known as the Bullitt Center in Seattle, Washington, which is the first corporate, fully certified living building in the United States, and is where the headquarters of what is today known as the International Living Futures Institute is located. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the origin.
So I want to get into the details of what makes a building a part of Living Village, but I do want to ask first, because we mentioned eco-theology earlier. Can you define what that means for our listeners?
So let me define it in this way. There was an article written, a very famous article by Lynn White, published in Science magazine in 1967, that described the attitude of Christianity, or many, many Christians, towards the earth. And it drew heavily from the first chapter of Genesis, an interpretation which said that humanity is over creation, and that was interpreted as meaning that humanity could treat creation at will or as it pleased. There's a very different interpretation of that, and that's epitomized for me in an event that took place in San Diego when Jimmy Carter was interviewed by two faculty members at the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature's annual meeting. There are 8,000 to 12,000 people present at these, and there were 3 or 4 in the auditorium. One of the questioners asked President Carter, said, "President Carter, you're very proud of your ecological record, but I find that to be in real tension with the fact that you teach a Bible class, and I think Christianity is heavily responsible, and Judaism, for the ecological crisis we're in. How do you square those two?" And President Carter said, "Well, you know that I've taught this Bible class virtually all my life at this little church in Plains, Georgia. But every year, our minister would always preach a sermon from the very text you're alluding to in Genesis 1, and would say, God has charged you with stewardship of this earth. You are part of creation, and you are responsible for how you treat creation. You are not to domineer and to abuse, but to protect and to guard. Your children's lives depend on this, your grandchildren, this community, and the future depends on how you treat our world." That, in a nutshell, is eco-theology. That's said in a very simple way, but it makes the point that we are part of creation and we are responsible to God for how we treat the world in which we live.
Right. And we only got about 2 minutes left here, but I would love to ask, what does make a building a part of the Living Village? And does that philosophy, is that something that the church needs to continue as a mission?
I think it does. So there are petals. So the idea of a living building is the symbol is a flower. A flower has to take everything that it needs in one place it can't move. And when it dies, it gives something back to the earth from which it sprang. So it has to generate 105% of its energy. It has to be net zero with water. It has to handle all its own waste. It can't use anything known to pose a threat to any form of life. I could expand, but that's the basic idea. And I'm hoping that the students who live in this living village will become what I call apostles of the environment. And just as you heard Stephen Ray talk about social justice, this is a form of that these people will be advocates for sustainability wherever they go.
And just 30 seconds, how has people reacted to the living village?
The reaction has been very positive. The ground healing, as I like to call it, went very well. We have the support of the university. It has received a great deal of attention. The real proof of the pudding will be, do other colleges and universities follow our lead by building residential structures when they build new residence for their students?
Well, that's a great point. You should definitely let us know if you hear of any other schools following Yale's lead. You've been listening to Dean Gregory Sterling, who is the Dean of the Yale Divinity School. Thank you so much for being on the show today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Thanks to Eddie Martinez and Eric McIntosh for their help on the show today. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.